Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Gamifiers meetup where I, Pete Jenkins, will interview Albert van der Meer. I've chosen Albert to interview because he's written a book called Press Start, all about gamification and marketing. I think it's great that we've got a book dedicated to the application of gamification to a particular industry, like marketing, particularly after last month's session where we spoke to Betty Adamu about gamification and market research. Seems like a really good follow-on to that. I first got my hands on a copy of this in December 2019 at Gamification Europe in Berlin. Look at that. And Albert must have been there too because it's signed. Yeah. And I'll get Albert to introduce himself in a second, but I'll just say he's got plenty of stamina. He was up till like 5, 6 a.m. I can't remember at the after party.
Something like that.
So, if you want a marketer who can go the distance, I think Albert's your man.
Thanks.
So, Albert, anything you'd like to add in terms of introducing yourself? What do you do? What's the name of your company?
Yep. Cool. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Pete said, yeah, Albert van der Meer. Suppose I can call myself a gamification consultant in a sense. Do workshops around the book, marketing gamification, also do workshops on team building and all that. I mean, obviously a little bit less recently due to the world being a little bit locked down, but in general, that was what it always is. My company is called astranger.com. I think through this system, you can probably click my profile and see links for LinkedIn and the website and all of that. So, and firstly, based in the Netherlands / Europe, Germany, UK, wherever traveling to. So if that's possible again at some point. And I think in terms of other things, I have a background in filmmaking and film production and psychology and psychoanalysis and all of that. So I think it all very much sort of connects in with gamification in general and sort of behavioral psychology. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me.
That's cool. The film production science probably explains why this book flows so well.
Well, I mean, we both myself and my co-author Dan, we like to think ourselves as a little bit of a writer. So I think we try to improve our writing skills as we moved along in the hopes that it would flow.
Now, I'm going to start with a question that's just like to put you in perspective. But what games have you played recently?
Recently. Well, I mean, I have a weekly Dungeons and Dragons game with 3 friends in the UK. One of them is Dan, the co-author. So we run that together. In terms of online games, I think probably most recently would be Teamfight Tactics from Riot Games, like the League of Legends sort of auto chess thing. And there's, just to keep myself busy every now and then playing Factorio, which is kind of like a building sim industrialization game. So very, very addictive game.
That's very cool. I like the Dungeons and Dragons approach. I'm teaching my daughter it. In fact, she's just been running her own adventure for me.
All right, excellent.
Which is cool. Just to mention everyone, I've got loads of questions I want to ask Albert, but if you've got any questions, stick them in the chat or the Q&A, and I will try and add them into the interview as we get to them. Okay. Talking about your co-author Dan, what's the relationship between you, and why did you decide to write this book together?
Well, first off, so the relationship between us is we met while working at a business school in the UK. He was in the marketing and I was sort of in marketing / communication, so doing a lot of corporate filmmaking. And he did more specific direct, social media marketing and that thing. And we sort of started talking via that and realized we have both an interest and an affinity for games and gaming. And, roughly around that period, which is like 2013, gamification started coming up properly. So we looked into it and started dabbling a bit and sort of the initial things that everybody did with the points and progression, all of that, and had some successes, had lesser successes as well. And, time went on. I moved back to the Netherlands, and then in 2017, we met up again, and he floated the idea of like, hey, why don't we just write a book about it? We're both interested in it. you have more gamification experiences, he has more marketing experience. We'll try and combine the two, and and we also thought we hadn't really found a specific book that gave a good primer for marketers in general, and that didn't have like a very specific, like, this is applicable knowledge straight away, and also served as a good reference book for gamification theories and practices in a general sense. So not only focusing on digital, only focusing on analog, but just having the overall concepts for it. So we thought, well, we can probably write one. Hopefully, at the very least, it'll be useful to us, but hopefully useful to a broader audience as well. And yeah, I mean, even nowadays, I still use the book as a reference for if I'm going through things. I'll be like, oh, what was it that I did? And I can find it quickly enough. And, naturally, of course, both wanting to be writers, we thought, well, if we write a book, we can scratch that off the bucket list.
Yeah. I like that. And I think it's really obvious that you've come at it with marketing and gamification expertise. It's not just about gamification. It's a real practical, this is how we started applying it. These are the approaches.
Yeah, we wanted it for people, even if they didn't want to read the entire book, they could essentially just go to the index page or content page or whatever and just go through and be like, okay, I want to know about that specific thing, jump to that part of the book, read through it, and be able to be, okay, I know enough that I can instantly use it right now. And if they want more background through it, they can obviously read the entire book if they wanted to.
That's very good. Yeah. I mean, I've read the entire book, but that's so I can ask you decent questions about it. So, and I'm going to hop around within this, and I've got more questions than I will fit in the time. So I'm going to pick and choose off you. But I'm going to start really simply, actually, because I like how you looked into the definitions of gamification by the type of source of where the definition came from. So you've got by consultant or by analyst or by professor, the academic side, which I thought was a really nice approach because you don't see that very often. So when you looked at Wehrback's definition, which is one of the most commonly used one, did you look at his more recent paper and definition that gamification is the process of making activities more game-like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of them. As you said, it's one of the main ones. So we definitely one of the first ones we looked at because he also has his Coursera course of gamification, which I think majority of people have probably run through if they had an interest or in gamification in a fleeting sense. So we went with that one, and it's also the most concise one. I think he sort of grabbed it from Sebastian Deterding in a general, like that sort of concise definition. And I think when we were going through it and the various consultant, analyst, professor, I mean, we could have chosen from a whole bunch, but we sort of chose the ones that we thought were the most prominent and fit in the best with how we wanted to move along through the definition. So we like the idea of Wehrback's thing of where he said he defines it as a process, and that allows it for a broader definition rather than saying this is specifically what it is. It's more of how you go through each piece and how you go, building each block. And I think that's how we also came at it with the book of like, you fit in all these various things and that's how the context works and all that. And that's where we kind of based our definition on, and sort of making the process of gamifying and making activities more game-like sort of helped us aim towards what we then eventually go for, like solving real life problems. So rather than going for digital or analog or anything like that, it's just the overall practice of how you do a gamification initiative, as it were.
Cool. So it's more practical.
Yeah, very much the practical aspect of it.
That's good. Then we dive in, and one of the things I noticed was that you talk about game design as being really important. So do you think game design skills are an essential requirement for successful gamification?
Well, I would say having an understanding of game design is definitely useful for having a successful gamification initiative. Though, say, when people hear like game design, they obviously think immediately of how to build a game. Sort of the AAA game, entertainment games probably pops up into most people's heads straight away when you say game design. I think it's more just the general concept of, or rather the base definition of game design, of how you put things together. I think if anybody were to want to do gamification correctly, or anything that uses a gamified element in a sense, you probably need to have a decent understanding of the theoretical knowledge that underpins game design. So probably, for example, I'd recommend reading through Jesse Schell's The Art of Game Design. I mean, it's a thick book, but as you go through, you learn each piece essentially of how it goes. And I think it's a very broad and sort of broad applicability in terms of how you need to do it. You don't necessarily need to have gone through the game design skills, learning it in developing games and all of that, I think, but having the understanding of it definitely helps with, getting a success at the end of it. Otherwise, you're very much just feeling a little bit in the dark and not knowing where to go.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would say out of the game design books, that's the one that's actually sitting on my desk.
All right.
So, I like that.
Yeah, no, it takes quite a while, and he goes through a lot of different lenses. But I think also as a reference book, it's quite good. So if you want something that to pick and choose and have something, it's one I regularly use as well.
Oh, I use the lenses all the time as well. There's an app, a free app you can download with the lenses.
Yep.
Quite like that one. Very useful. I mean, building on the game design and the definitions you looked at, you then come up with your own definition, but just for marketing gamification. Why did you feel you needed to come up with another definition?
So the thought process behind it was, well, we didn't want to necessarily have an entirely new definition that superseded all the other definitions. We didn't want to be that presumptuous in terms of saying, well, our definition will be the one that everyone goes for. Because there's so many various definitions and so many various situations that you can apply gamification to and how you use it. So each definition has its own, purpose and setting for it. So I think we have Brian Burke's setting in there, definition in there. We have Yukai Chow's. We have a whole bunch of other people, and each one is either for a digital version or analog. And I think for us, it was more in terms of collating a lot of those definitions and the research that sits around it, and then wanting to give the reader a custom definition that they can just go back to while reading the book.
Cool.
And so it's sort of an
definition. I meant to ask that.
Yeah. The definition is essentially so marketing gamification is the thoughtful application of relevant game elements to solve real life customer problems that are connected to your organization. And we thought, well, that sort of fits everything in there that we discuss in the book in terms of, aligning goals between customer and organization, the thoughtful application of relevant game elements, rather than saying where we've seen so many times where companies have gone, we want to gamify it, so we're just going to grab an element that works somewhere else and throw it in there. So we wanted to, really highlight the thoughtful application, have a good think and come up with a good strategy as to why that's the relevant element that needs to go in there and why it works. And it should hopefully work for your customer and for you rather than being one-sided.
I liked it a lot because gamification is so broad. I think having that specific definition for just marketing is really useful. I'm thinking about setting a task for my university students to come up with the definitions for different areas. Like, what would it be for sustainability? What would it be for human resources? That sort of thing. How would you?
I think I think just the fact of how everything is a bit different, and you need to have each approach is different. It's very personalized, and within gamification, the whole customization thing. I think it's very difficult to come up with sort of a theory of everything definition, and it's sort of it simplifies it maybe a bit too much for certain aspects. So we just thought, well, we'll just do one for the book, and then people can go back to it, and it hopefully helps them, grasp it a little bit as they're going through it. And then if they use it afterwards, brilliant. If not, then at least it was there to help them along the way.
I think it's really useful. I'm going to move on to, I think it's always good to hear about some case studies. And one struck me early on in the book, which was you use the example of Miss Social campaign for Playboy in the book. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about this and why it was so successful?
Yeah, well, as we were going through the book, because we wanted to have various case studies and examples from real life and the real world and all of that, just so that people understand a bit better. And in all the research, I hadn't actually come across this one. I thought it would probably be a bit of fun and just interesting for people to see that, not just the traditional companies, as it were, use it. So found the Miss Social for Playboy. And the concept behind it was that they Playboy wanted to engage more recent generations of users, the ones that spend more time on social media platforms and using apps and all of that, rather than their traditional market, which bought the magazine and read the articles, as it were. So they partnered with Bunchball, a sort of gamification company in the US, and they created a Facebook-like social media app that offered a platform for these new users that they could, show, exhibit and express their own artistry, as it were, and they could provide content. So the models would provide the content, and then followers would go through there, and through that the followers were sort of self-empowered with a voting system, and then they could use the votes or whatever for their favorite models, and then those models would go up in rankings, and then Playboy would select them to be part of their sort of Playboy community, as it were. And by the numbers, it looked very successful. It was an 85% increase in re-engagement with the Playboy brand in general. And I think the main success behind it was probably the community generation. So despite of what maybe your views are on how Playboy does it, individuals want to express themselves in a certain way, and there are people who want to see it. And the back and forth and the interaction clearly worked. It was an interest, and they provided it all. So I think just that building of a community and allowing the community to be self-empowered and discussing it all was why it was eventually so successful.
That's cool. In fact, I think it's fairly obvious from reading the book that you think communities are a really powerful marketing mechanism for brands. Why do you think gamifying communities is so powerful?
I think so. Gamifying a community is a powerful method because people inherently want to share and engage with each other in like-minded activities. I mean, even those that may not be as socially inclined to, be fully active and extroverted in a community, everyone still gains something from the collective mind, as it were. So if you have a Facebook group or anything like that, they're all multi-layered experiences for a community. Some are active and they're constantly doing things, and the more you gamify it in the sense of like giving them motivations and using the motivational levers within that, the more they're going to be active and the more the community grows. I think probably, let's just say, for example, I'd say almost 80% of a community is probably passive engagement, whereas there's a 20% active engagement, and they're sort of driving it all and sort of helping people to be more engage either active or passively, and using the gamification mechanics for it helps a brand to develop a more inclusive community around what they want and how they do it and all of that.
That's cool. You seem to come at things from a narrative point of view as well. So how do you use narrative within gamifying the community, and how closely can you tie that to the brand's narrative?
Well, I think narrative should speak to the individuals in the community, and the story that, as it were, so the brand should have its own story, and that should reflect the message of the organization. So for it to be truly effective as a narrative from their message, it needs to be authentic and transparent of what the message is. I think a good example of this is the advertising campaign from Chipotle, I think from a few years ago now. It was called Back to Start. And it showed a farmer engaged in the usual highly industrialized farming methods of, having battery stacked animals and just pumping out the food in just an unethical way. And then the advertisement slowly shows him going back to the start, naturally going back to more sustainable and ethical farming practices. And that's how he delivered the food to the consumer. And I think in terms of, it wasn't an overt selling point from Chipotle's aspect of like, just buy our meat, buy our food, we're that good. It just showed of like, this is the story, this is the message we believe in, that it needs to be more sustainable and ethical, as it were. And that sort of spoke to the consumer, the community as a whole, and that sort of allowed them to align the goals and wants and messages, and created a mutual bond of understanding between the consumer and the actual organization. And I think that there aren't sort of overt gamified mechanics in the sense of you need to have an action, but I think the motivations behind it in terms of understanding the purpose of Chipotle and their message for what it is, and showing the sense of belonging and inclusiveness for them understanding the consumer. That sort of worked. Why that marketing campaign worked so well.
Cool, good example. Like that. I'm going to move on a little bit. So there's quite a few chapters on the neuroscience, the psychology, the economic behaviors. As you said, you were trying to use it as a reference book for someone getting into gamifying marketing. But out of all of those, and there's a lot of theories in there, is there one theory that you find yourself using most of all when you're describing to a prospect why gamification works?
Well, I wouldn't say there's one specific theory that I jump to every time, because each prospect's probably a little bit different, and each one has a varying level of interest or understanding as to which theories work for them or not. I'd say probably, in general, there's a wide selection of theories and frameworks, and a lot of them are from the behavioral psychology side anyway. The main ones I tend to move towards are sort of Edward Deci self-determination theory, and then the extension of that with Daniel Pink's drives, and then obviously Maslow's hierarchy with the various needs and drives that people have. I think that's in the book. We also base our 6 motivational levers on those various things. So we have the purpose, mastery, autonomy, belonging, esteem, safety, and needs. And that's sort of, I tend to go with those because those are more the psychological drives that everyone has in varying degrees. And that's how, when I'm discussing gamification with someone, it's those ones that I tap on, because that's generally a good generalization of how the things work and why people are become engaged in certain mechanics rather than one specific one for that thing.
Cool. At least you managed to narrow it down to 3. So that's cool, right, isn't it? I mean, I like the way you use Maslow's hierarchy of needs for your building blocks of gamification design, which you use as the structure in the rest of the book.
Yeah.
How did you discover which game elements match each level within Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the esteem at the top?
Well, to be completely honest, it was a bit of a puzzle game. So myself and Dan, we had many discussions over Discord and Skype and so forth of how to really put it together, because we like the idea of the how the tower works, and each one has a step, and there are sort of blocks inside them that you can work as you go along. And we, through a lot of research and lateral thinking, and from our own experience and experience of others and case studies, we sort of looked at which mechanics and elements traditionally used within gamification and the motivators associated with them, which ones worked in that sort of hierarchy of needs and tower building way. And eventually through that, as I said, it sort of puzzled it together, and then discussing it and saying, okay, well, this one works here quite well. Does this one work? No. And sort of moving through it and sort of discussing it and making sure that, we're both happy with how each one fit in properly. I mean, in general, we didn't want to overwhelm the reader in a sense of saying like, well, here's a plethora of mechanics that work for each level and each need. These are good ones that we think work well from the research and personal experience. And I mean, there are others. We don't, exclude anything, but probably this is a good starting point.
I think that comes across quite well in there, actually. You've taken a few game mechanics and explained them and where they fit into the structure really well. And then I quite like how you've joined up the different levels with what you call the staircase of purpose. Can you tell us a bit about that, why it's so important?
So probably give a bit of context in terms of how we named them. So we had all the different motivational levers. We thought we'll have a tower framework just to give people a visual of how to move through the experience and the process of gamifying something. And we also like the tower idea because, games and all of that, if anybody ever played, Castlevania and or Diablo, you have a sort of, you're working your way up or down to the final boss. And we wanted to give a good metaphor for each one. So for purpose, we used the staircase. So it's moving along through the tower, and how your journey is defined by the purpose that you have and going through that staircase. So I think, everybody, any initiative that you do, be it gamified or otherwise, you require some sort of goal or an objective, or purpose for doing it. As it's generally the base intrinsic drive that motivates people into action. If you don't have a purpose, you are probably a little bit lost into where you want to go. I think the example we use in the book is the popular one with Wikipedia, where the individuals who maintain Wikipedia do it completely free of charge. Their sole purpose is to ensure that the platform has accurate information and is being kept up to date. So that is their purpose. It's a very altruistic and selfless purpose, and they go through it just because they want to, and they feel that the rest of the world deserves this level of knowledge.
So would you say it's always a player focused purpose as opposed to the brand?
It depends on the initiative, as it were. I think it's two sides of a coin almost. You need to have there is a player focused purpose of what the player or the user is going towards, what their goal is, and then you also have the brand's one. And we mentioned it a few times, I mentioned it already, is you need to have some sort of alignment between the two of them. Because otherwise, if there's only one side of it and you're only going for the player's purpose, it may not always be what the company needs. And then the other side, the company has its purpose and it slowly strip mines through its target audience because it has a completely different purpose from the other side. So I think you need to consider it in terms of both sides. What does the one want? What does the other want? And can you align it enough that you're both getting something out of it? So that you hopefully have a win-win.
Yeah, that sounds good. Have you got an example? Maybe where you use narrative to tie the branding purpose together into the staircase of purpose?
I probably say one I recently came across for doing research with Innocent, the drink brand, where their sort of purpose is to be more sustainable and inclusive with the community, and the people who drink it are obviously more health oriented anyway. And Innocent slowly moving towards that sort of having recyclable bottles and all of that, and that's their narrative isn't in the strictest sense of this is a story from beginning, middle, and end. It's the narrative of including their consumers and explaining to them, okay, this is what we're doing, this is how we're moving through it. It's telling their story of what they're doing and then taking the consumer with them along it. I think that both purposes work well because everybody wants to have be part of that sustainable concept.
I think that's the key bit, isn't it? It's got to be something people want to be part of.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's purpose. Obviously, you also talk about mastery, which we generally use a lot in gamification. And you like your metaphors. You use gateways as a metaphor for mastery. Why is that?
Yeah. So we continued on with the visualization of the tower, and from the staircase we go to a gateway. And I think to master anything, you eventually come up to a gate, a doorway, or a threshold that you need to pass in order to have proven that you mastered that specific aspect. So once you've passed through that gateway, you are now one level higher. And I think it's anything that has a progress, anything has a prerequisite, any sort of requirements in that sort of the visualization of a gateway. And then you take, for example, anything from the army or martial arts. Each thing has a rank or a belt, as a very specific sort of example, and you're moving through it each step by step. In a general sense, in the real world, if you're going through a course, it's not necessarily a specific mastery that has a clear point, but you're still going through that gateway process. And, having discussed it recently, sort of in many games, you have a very clear visual gate that you need to get through before the game allows you to continue. And I think if anybody's ever played any of the Dark Souls games from Software, there's a very clear missed gate that unless you pass that boss and prove that you've mastered the mechanics of the game, you don't get to continue. So I think in terms of the mastery aspect of that, that's why we use gateways.
I like that. I think it makes it easy to understand how you're going to build it as well. The staircase, the levels of the tower, and the gateways just makes it easier, doesn't it? Very clever.
Yeah. we sort of wanted to go through, as we were discussing, it's like, well, what else would be in a tower? What kind of furniture does it have?
Like that. Trip hazards, things like that.
Yeah.
So I mean, to drill down to a couple of game elements, you talk about points. Points are useful for giving instant feedback, things like that. And one of my favorite phrases in your book is, do not make points pointless. Yeah. So what did you mean by that? And can you give us an example where a marketing campaign has got this wrong or right, or both?
Or both. I can probably give both. Well, what we meant by it is that we've so often come across it where, and I'm pretty sure the people listening and others have seen it where, and I had actually mentioned it earlier before as well, where a company just grabs the mechanic, and in this case it would be the points one, and just adds it there just because, well, points motivate people. People like gathering points. Any sort of, idle game will be, click, 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 and you get points. But after a while, the user gets burned out because there's no inherent value to the point then. So it becomes pointless, hence the phrase for it. So we wanted that, if you're going to use those kind of base things like the PBLs, the points, badges, leaderboards, there needs to be some sort of meaning or value behind it. Otherwise, don't use it at all. And that's sort of relates back to the, thoughtful, relevant game elements and mechanics. I think in terms of, the example we use in the book where, it worked out is with the Starbucks rewards. So and obviously this doesn't work for everyone. Certain individuals are more, spoken to by this mechanic than others are. But in general, for Starbucks, they had a definite increase in terms of engagement of how they use their reward system, where people could collect points and collect, various bits and pieces, kind of like a loyalty program. And the meaning behind is that they could then spend that again for more Starbucks products. So there was a value to the user. They were already fans of the product and they could spend more on getting more of the product. An example of where it didn't work is with the old Google News system from, I think, almost 10 years ago now, where if you read an article, Google would give you an achievement or a point of like, yay, you have read 20 articles on sport. And then would suddenly recommend a spuriously related article so that you could keep getting more points of like, now you've read 40 articles on sport. And after a while, people just disengaged completely because, well, okay, great, I've read 40 articles on sport. What am I getting?
Yeah.
Nothing. I got a badge that told me I did something I already knew.
At that point, it's barely even a representation of progress, is it?
No, it's just, well, thanks, that was great. And then people just as you can imagine, obviously that system didn't last very long, so they scrapped it completely.
How very true. So many questions to choose from. I like how you articulate the 3 phases of belonging. I think it brings it back to the community aspect as well, but I've got them as seeking, building, and comparing. Can you tell us a bit more about this, and then a bit more about how it works in practice?
Yeah, so within the book, we wanted to use the 3 phases, as you said, seeking, building, and comparing. So seeking is the initial phase where an individual who has an interest goes out in search of a community that they can be part of that shares their interests. And once they've found that, then they go into the building phase. And the building phase has both an active and a passive one, much like the seeking one. They'll have sort of active, passive versions of it. And the individual can either build actively, share their knowledge, wanting to contribute to the community as a whole. Passive one would be obviously consuming the knowledge in a sense and building it for themselves. And if they wanted to, they could reshare. And then the final 3rd phase is the comparing one, which in the book we sort of say it's the them versus us phase, where you get this concept of people wanting to create an exclusive community. This obviously has a positive and a negative effect depending on how the community is. So positive is obviously, everybody feels more inclusive, everybody's working together. Negative is then, well, we don't want to be with them because they're different, so we're going to exclude them. But it's dependent on how the community feels and how they're, working through that. And I'd say in terms of how this works in practice, I'm not going to use a marketing, this very specific game example. Okay. Which I think and has the most theory and research behind it is probably the World of Warcraft community, in terms of how their community is like the theory crafting behind it. There's a great many people that enjoy the game. They seek out like-minded individuals for various aspects of the game in terms of how the dungeons works or raids work or the crafting aspects of it. And then they go into heavy theory crafting. How do the numbers work within the game? How the developers, figure out how to do these things. So they start building on there. And then within that, they create little communities. And these communities then manifest themselves in guilds and clans and all of that, and then you get that sort of comparing thing of like who's the better guild, who can get further in the game versus another guild. You have that sort of concept of it's an overall community, everybody's still driving towards the same thing, but each little pocket's working along for itself.
I like that. It's a good example. I remember a few years ago IBM were looking for their future leaders, and then they thought, we'll just look internally and see who we've got who leads a guild in World of Warcraft, because they're good at bringing together people with different skill sets to achieve something.
Yeah, no, that's a very good idea. You have the initial skills there anyway, and you've instantly gained a sort of a gamified concept of people enjoy doing it, so why not get them to do it more?
I think it's a cunning plan.
Very much.
Okay, so I kind of want to bring it all together and take you back to the metaphor of the tower and the different levels, and how that related to Maslow. And I was wondering if you could walk us through an example you've worked on, and maybe a game element or game elements you've used at each level of the tower, because I think that's will help bring it all together.
Yeah. Well, don't have a very recent example in a sense of working with a client, as it were, just because how the world changed a fair bit. But I would probably say the best one is for having worked on developing a workshop that's essentially based on the book.
Okay.
And how that overall experience gets built. So not only trying to preach it, but also practice what I preach in a sense. So actually using what I've put in the book and developing a workshop around that. So in terms of like how we went through the tower. So we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we've gone through the motivational levers and how all that sits. And then our tower is the basic one that anybody will come across, which has sort of the discovery floor. We call it the floor, just for the purposes of visualization with the tower. So the discovery floor, the onboarding floor, the scaffolding floor, and the adept floor. And how we move through that, and how each one has a motivational lever within it, and which mechanics fit with that lever quite well. And as I said before, it's not exclusive. Anyone can work in any way. And it's sort of adding the little blocks and how you build the tower as you go along. And I think within the workshop is, the goal, the overall experience has a narrative. There's a goal that by the end of the workshop, the participants will be working by creating their own sort of gamified marketing campaign. So very experiential. So the discovery floor is the initial part, information exchange, where we build the narrative of the overall experience, wanting people to understand what it is. And there's a belonging part in it, which is that motivator of how, little teams work together. And that's how they get to know each other. So then we move on to sort of the onboarding floor. So the next one. And, the motivator in there is mastery. The mechanics around that is like defining what objectives they want to achieve out of the workshop. What are the obstacles that are going to be in their way if they want to create a gamified marketing campaign, and what is the progression to get to that point? So how does the customer journey look like for their target audience? So working with that way, and what the customers then, what the participants then also see for the customer's goals and what the customer's obstacles are. So again, bringing it back to that sort of alignment between the two.
So you're getting them to design their own level, in effect, with their own goals and their own obstacles.
Yeah.
Very lazy.
Yeah. So sort of going through that. I mean, getting them to be active in it and using the applicable knowledge is the main thing. And then obviously, as you said, getting them to do it. So the next one would be the scaffolding floor, and that's the autonomy motivational lever. Like, okay, well, we've gone through all these things, helped you, guide you. Now, you need to start coming up with your own customizations, as it were. And those are the main mechanics within scaffolding that we went with. Customize it for yourself, for your customer, and what are the methods of communication that you're going to use, internally and towards your audience. So how does that message for the marketing campaign actually going to work? And then once they've sort of done all of that, the final thing that they do is actually building a prototype for the marketing, gamified marketing campaign. I think building an overall one would probably take too much time, but within that session, they sort of get in there and sort of build the initial prototype, and then that sort of brings in all the elements. And naturally, I have then, from my side, it'll be the mentoring mechanic in a sense, like guiding them a little bit. And then beyond that, it's the rewards, consequences, win, fail conditions, depending on how well everything went and how they managed to, deliver what they wanted to do. And that's how that sort of workshop comes together. And I thought, rather than having like a specific example, I thought that one worked quite well.
So do you get them to come together as a community just during the workshop, or is there something bigger they can belong to afterwards? I.e., where do they go when they get to the adept floor?
Yeah, well, depending on the sort of the client, as it were, so who the participants are. If they're part of the same company, then they have their own organic thing. But from my perspective, I very much like it so that they can continue to be part of a community in terms of they can talk to me and talk to each other still beyond that, sort of extending the knowledge, as it were, and then returning back to it as often as they'd like to or want to. So it's that sort of the adept, as it were. Within the book as well, we wanted the adept to be, something that goes beyond it, because many of the other, our other colleagues have the sort of end game concept at the top of the tower, and that's where it ends. It's like the very specific, terminology of end game and no further. We wanted to avoid that, so a continuation of knowledge and just getting better and better and better, or reiterate it again and then build a second version that's even better.
I think that's really important for long-term marketing, isn't it? You want loyal, engaged customers, not just during the game, but afterwards. So how do we continue and continue? Exactly, I think that's where the community bit is actually really important as well.
Definitely.
That comes across in the book quite nicely. I was sparking ideas all the time. All right, conscious of the time, so anyone who's watching, please add any questions. I've got a couple more I'm going to hit you with in a second. All right. One is just on leveling up. You recommend a rough rule of thumb of increasing the points needed to level up by about 20% each level. One, I was wondering where you came up with that one, and also it made me think there might be quite a few levels. So do you find you have to design a lot more levels if you're using this sort of algorithm?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted something that was just a general concept for people to start off with. I mean, the initial thought that came from, I think it was one of Michael Wu's talks at Gamification Conference. I think it was the one in Amsterdam. And he had a much more specific formula for it, if I remember correctly.
He patented it. I remember.
Sorry.
So you have to change it.
Yeah. I think more might be the one in Brighton. Well, irrelevant, but yeah. Dan and I, we discussed it a fair bit in terms of like, well, do we want it to be very specific, or do we want it to have a sort of a broad concept of how it works through it? And we eventually just conceded on doing the 20%. That gives it enough differentiation that allows people to have enough scale to progress to the next thing and not be too quick as it moves along into the higher levels. And it also allowed then individuals to determine how many levels they also wanted to add in there in terms of the amount of work that goes into it. And because it's then so broad, they can refine it to their own concept of what they require for that experience, as it were. So we didn't want to close it off too much, but also keep it broad enough that people could use it as and when they wanted it.
That's cool. The one thing I like about Michael Wu's approach is you basically work backwards from how many levels you want. Maybe I've designed 7 levels of membership reward tier, so then I can work back from that on what percentage.
I think in general. I think in general, I mean, what you just touch on is it's always a good idea to sort of start from the end and work your way back, which is why a lot of the things is very much the purpose and how to, what's the objective you want to reach at the end? What's the goal for you and your customer? And then sort of building it back in a sense of where you want to start.
Cool. We got a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to ask you one. Antonina asks, how would you apply your approach to creating or strengthening personal brand? Sort of more of a self-marketing substance.
I think for a personal brand, it's down to how you see yourself, how you want to bring it across. The main things is, I'm always going to bring it back to the sort of the motivational levers. So it's what's the purpose of your personal brand? Starting with it there. What's the objective you want to do with them? Then how you then move on beyond that. So if you want to, create a community around it, you go into the belonging thing. What's the narrative? How are you going to engage the people with your own brand? So it doesn't vary in terms of, big, multi-million dollar, euro, pound companies, or just your own personal brand. The mechanics and the motivations that sit around it are essentially the same thing, because you obviously also want to promote yourself. You also want to have, a livelihood. You want to be independent, probably, if you are doing your own personal brand. So you're using very similar kind of concepts and mechanics in that sense. And in a general sense, I'd say as a, self-employed consultant as well, I do that. So I generally use what's in the book is what I do as well. So it kind of fits in there.
Okay. So a good way to check that out would be to check you out online, look at your website, see how Albert's doing it for real. Yeah.
Read the book.
Read the book. Obviously, read the book. Antonina says, "Thank you for the answer." Linda has a question. I think it's quite broad, but how can the game build team cooperation?
How can the game build team cooperation? Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because it's inherent to what the game is. So I'm going to make the assumption that it's a collaborative game in a sense, probably, if you want to build team cooperation. The initial thing that I always think is that you need to have some sort of easy way to communicate. Any team that wants to cooperate, wants to collaborate, wants to continue, needs to be able to communicate. And I think a lot of companies have an issue when they create something that has a community around it and they gamify it in a sense, that they think that it needs a very specific communication channel. So they start developing their own communication channels. I think you almost need to have the faith that it can be an organic experience, that individuals find their own way to communicate. You just need to say that this is the way it'll be. If they want to communicate through WhatsApp, brilliant. Just tell them it's WhatsApp, and then people will do that. And beyond that, you need to then have an invisible guiding hand, as it were, within it. I think a lot of people think that once the game is there and we've created some sort of method for communities to exist and to communicate, then it'll just happen magically on its own. And often that isn't the case, because then a lot of people don't want to, or they just don't feel comfortable or something. So you need to initially have sort of an individual who comes in there and helps guide it. I mean, the metaphor you could almost think of is how you care for a plant. You put the seed in there and you need to come back there every now and then to give it a bit of water, give it a bit of care, and move it along. And eventually it'll grow into a large enough plant that you can just put it outside, and then, it exists on its own. So that's how you need to sort of develop with a community and, team cooperation in a sense.
Cool.
I hope that kind of answered it.
I think so. You had three things there. I think a collaborative game, which I fully agree with, good communications, and I guess an invisible dungeon master helping things along.
Yeah, dungeon masters are very good term for it.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question about the book, which is actually possibly my favorite bit of your book. Is where you figure out whether you have a game or a gamified solution, and where the difference is. I mean, I so often see projects go down the wrong route here. So how do you know if you've got it right? Do you have an example?
How do you know if I've got it right? An example that fits within it. I think in terms of the way we describe it in the book is whether it always comes back to the alignment between customer goals and organization goals. And currently failing of a specific example, but I'd say maybe, Duolingo or Nuffield Gym. Some along those kind of lines, where they've sort of gamified the experience in a way, and it feels very much as a game at certain points, but you are still learning something, and both you and the organization is getting something out of it. And I think if you've built a game and it's fun and it's enjoyable and all of that, and it becomes more of an entertainment game, then it's very much focused on the user and the player, and the company is probably not getting much out of it. And obviously, if it's an entertainment game, they're getting revenue from it. But I assume if you want to have a gamified experience, there's an extra thing that comes out of it. So, for example, with Duolingo, it's people are learning things. People are are getting better in the language overall, and they're engaging with the company. If they want more, they can pay more and they can add more. Same with Nuffield Gym. The overall goal for it is that people get healthier, and be fitter and have a better work-life balance in that sense. And that's both the goal of the company and the goal of the user. I think if only one happens, then you've either created a game or just a terrible experience.
Great answer. Yeah, I agree. So I think we're coming to the end of the interview. Actually, I quite want to know, what are you working on at the moment, or what comes next?
What comes next? Currently working on various workshops and so forth. Also doing research for the next book, which is hopefully going to be around team building and team experience and how group dynamics work and how within the gamification field. So that's the overall academic side of it. And then, I think other than that, just continuing on and trying to get through how the world is at the moment.
Sure. Well, I look forward to reading that as well. Hey, look, thanks for being so open and informative with your answers, answering the questions from our audience. So I guess I should ask, where can we get a copy of the book, and how can people best get in touch with you?
Best way to get in touch with me first is you can either go to the website. There's any number of ways to send a message to me or email me. LinkedIn, also a good way. Twitter, probably as well. I think as I said before, if you click on the little icon on this remote thing, you probably get the majority of the links through that. On the website as well, there are links on how to get the book. It's available through Bloomsbury or through Amazon, probably the most easiest. And it's on Kindle. It's currently it's only in English, but I believe from next year it might even be in Portuguese, according to the publisher.
Oh,
so
that's fantastic news. I like that. Yeah. Okay, that wraps this up. What I'm going to do now is end this part of the presentation, and we'll all end up back on the tables. So there you can ask Albert any other questions you've got. Okay. So thank you very much, Albert.
Pleasure. Thank you, Pete.
Goodbye for now.